Welcome back, everybody. Welcome to week 5, EDL 740, Graduate Research, Intro to Graduate Research Zoom session for this week. I'm glad you came back from reading your post and having interactions with you by email and other means. I get the distinct impression that some of you are swamped. I think I've mentioned to you that both of my daughters are educators and both of my sons-in-laws are school administrators, and watching them try to navigate April is bringing back some memories, and not all of them pleasant ones. A reminder for you, and tonight we'll proceed as our previous evenings have. By the way, Margie, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can anybody hear me? Yes, thank you. All right. And I'm recording.
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, thank you.
How are you? All right.
Thank you very much. As a reminder to you, the format of the course will remain the same even through week 7, except in week 7 we will not have a Zoom session and you will have a final. You should be well along in the process of your final right now. I've been pitching a few preemptive strikes at you along the way with regard to your final. And of course, your proposal polishing is part of that. And reminder also that on that last week, week 7, your submission deadlines is not Sunday, but Saturday evening, May 4. That gives me a chance to try to get through all of your submissions for your learning task before I have to submit grades on that following Monday. It's amazing to me when I read through your stuff how we range in age, I think, from 26 to like 55 or so in your class, of the 101 of you. And you come from such varied backgrounds. You're working all over the United States. Some of you came from, this is a second career for you. Some of you came through traditional education preparation programs. Others of you went the alternative certification route. And you just bring such a wide ranging field of experiences and knowledge base with you into this process, which makes it a little bit challenging for me, but also kind of invigorating. It's kind of fun. But as I think about it, I think it's constructivism at work. Because we're all becoming more proficient in our understanding of the graduate research in general. And some of you have actually been involved in some pretty detailed and research, formal kinds of research. And then some of you have just been practitioners in the field and sort of sideways consumers of research. As I told you in week 1, our goal through the LSU Shreveport program is not to turn you into researchers, but to make you proficient consumers of research and discerning consumers of research. Through those of you that have been working in the public schools, and I see a lot of chatter both in your learning task submissions as well as your discussion forum posts. We're in that window of time in the year when the high stakes accountability tests are being deployed at all levels, from the elementary grades all the way up through the end of course exams. And those students that are in dual credit classes are also taking their final exams, will be soon taking their final exams in their college coursework. But the high stakes accountability has driven many of us to become pseudo research aficionados because we've had to deal mostly with that quantitative, and several of you have alluded to this in your comments and your postings. You've had to become pseudo consumers of quantitative research, which is basically the number stuff that that Jim, I beat you. You're 60, I'm 61. But welcome to the party. You know, 60 is the new 30, I think. But we become fairly adept at consuming, and I'm going to use a verb, metabolizing the numbers, because we've been forced to do that over the years. So what, from my observations of your submissions and what I'm seeing out of you all, it seems like you had a reasonably secure past in dealing with some quantitative stuff, although you this week certainly you got exposed to some vocabulary that many of you had not ever seen before. But the qualitative research seems to be a sort of a new venture for most of you. For what it's worth, for those of you that are headed into school administration, school leadership kind of stuff, in my view and from my experience, the wisest leaders that I know, the wisest school leaders, well, not just school leaders, wisest leaders of any organization, are the ones that rely both on the qualitative and the quantitative data that they can consume, as long as that they are convinced that is valid data and quality data. There's always that crappy stuff, and that's part of the reason that we drag you all through this course, is to help you get a bit more adept at being able to discern the difference in what Dr. John Schultz called good evidence and not so good evidence. In the Tool Talk discussion forum prompt that I pitched at you all week before last, Dura really, she alluded to a concept called grand families, and it reminded me of my first year of being a principal. Someone asked me at the end of that first year what the most profound learning I'd had as a result of that, and I said, you know, I never knew until spending my first year as a principal the challenges. Someone's got their microphone on. If you turn it off, please.
When you going? Yeah. What size is that?
Who is that?
31.
Turn your mic off, please. Thank you. Anyway, one of my most profound learnings the first year that I was a campus principal, and I guess I should have been aware of it before then, but was just the monumental challenges that grandparents have when they're trying to raise their grandchildren, and single parents. That it was just it was something that I was not fully aware of the challenges that those folks have in trying to get those young pups mold them into good citizens. And I know there may be some of you that are grandparents raising grandchildren. If you are, I don't know it, but I know that there's some of you that are single parents, and it's just it makes my heart hurt at the challenges that you all face. I'm so proud that you're willing to do it and that you can do it. On the discussion post that I titled "Proposal Ad Nauseum," I was trying to get you to dig just a little bit deeper on your proposal question, and that prompt was designed to get you to begin to think one step further along the way. Many of you have proposed and revised your questions, and you've got some very nice questions in process. But when I pitched that discussion prompt at you and specifically asked you to think about the challenge, I only asked you for one significant challenge that you thought you might face. It was apparent to me that caused some of you to take a step back and begin to think about the logistics of trying to pull off a study. And certainly this week in the content that you had, or this past week in the content that you examined with regard to quantitative research, you got a peek inside some more research tools and some research techniques and some statistical manipulations that can be done with data. But as you think about, okay, I've got a really cool question I want to ask and I would like to find the answer to, But then when you start thinking about how do I identify the sample set, how do I get access to the sample set, how do I actually collect credible data from that sample set, then you begin to see the challenges that researchers have in trying to put together a nice tight study that can expose something meaningful for our profession, and perhaps and hopefully improve student outcomes along the way as a result. Dr. Schultz's video on research paradigms seemed to have thrown a number of you for a loop, and I thought it might. He certainly exposes you to some concepts and some terminology that I think most of you were not all that familiar with. A few of you were. From your comments in the learning task, it's apparent to me that the mushiness of it is the thing that was causing you the most discomfort. And let me pitch a couple of words at you. I don't think Dr. Schultz used these words, but fundamentally, what I think one of the main points he was trying to get across to you is that the research is really, particularly educational research, runs in two directions. One, it's an ontological study, which basically means ways of being. And some of those 6 or 7 questions that he pitched at you as a basis for research, some of you, through your language, I could see you were scratching your heads. But a consideration of ways of being, and then there's the epistemological side of the research, which helps us examine ways of knowing. So that you got these parallel pathways and it's really hard to separate those into 2 different categories, because that's our humanness. If we're not learning, we're dying or dead. And so it's important for us to understand how we are, how we came to be, who we are, what drives us, and then the implications of that for how we learn and how we build on that learning, the ways of knowing, the epistemological component. And I would like to tell you that it's black and white, but no, it's not. It's a world of gray. I'm reminded of a story I read in a book several years ago, in which the author said, whenever you think you're on good solid ground, think about this. You take a look at a chair sitting in the room and you ask yourself, is that chair moving? You look at it carefully and you come to the conclusion that no, that chair is not moving. When in fact it is. As a matter of fact, it's moving at about 1,000 miles an hour because it's on the earth, and the earth is spinning at about 1,000 miles an hour. And the chair is moving in an orbit around the sun because it's on the earth. And that orbit, the earth orbits the sun at about 67,000 miles per hour. And our entire solar system is hurtling through space at a speed of 515,000 miles per hour. So no, the chair is really not still. It just seems that way to us in relation to the environment that we're judging it. Same thing is going on in research. You have to think about the context in which you're conducting the study, and it doesn't matter if it's quantitative or qualitative. It's always nested within that context, and those contexts are just full of what my dissertation chair used to call confounding and mediating variables that have an impact on the outcomes of the study. Dr. Schultz, and then also that learning task, what was it? I think learning task 4.3 really exposed you all to some pretty dense vocabulary that's part and parcel of the research community, and assumptions and context and semantics. Those are words that we've been using in the course of the class, but then you get into things like variability and interpretation, lenses, positivism, post-positivism, interpretivism, parameters, non-parameters, the whole parade of validities. And so it can become a little bit mind-numbing. And aren't you thankful that I'm not going to give you a test and ask you to define all that stuff or use it in a sentence or tell me how you're going to use it in a study? But it is important that you be exposed to those things, not to mention all the statistical tests and manipulations that we can use in quantitative studies. And several of you alluded to those in your responses. There's all kinds of t-tests and ANOVAs and chi-squares and those kinds of things that we, as I told you last week, we massage the numbers till they tell us what we want them to. Devera noted in one of her posts that there's a need for clarity and conciseness, and I absolutely agree with that. And not only in the context of research, but in school leadership. I remember having, when I was a high school principal, a large high school principal, having a conversation with one of my superintendent at the time about the importance of precision in language and succinctness. And he and I landed on very different ends of the continuum on there, because I was a firm believer that we needed to be very precise and very succinct in our language when communicating with our audiences, and he, on the other hand, preferred lots of words and lots of filler words to expand the text. I'm pretty convinced in these days, especially in the context of social media and the way we read now on the run and while we're driving down the interstate and all those things. And my lovely bride Mo has convinced me to write my blog in that format, is to keep it really tight, to keep it pithy, try to use as precise a language as we possibly can when we're communicating with others. When you read studies, though, as you know now, during the research mining, researchers tend to try to expand and expand and expand the language so that they're describing for you everything that they possibly can, almost down to the type of paper they used in the copy machine while they were conducting the study. So I think there's probably a nice happy medium in there, but fortunately you're not going to be required to actually conduct a study, but you are being required to think about how you might pull it off. Dr. Schultz mentioned that business of good evidence, and I alluded earlier to you that it's very important to me that I help you all move along your learning journey in such a way that you become more discerning consumers, not only of educational research, but research in general. All you got to do is poke around just a little bit, for instance, on the topic of health medicine. You know, well, the hot topic in this day and time is vaccines, and you can find pretty convincing research on both ends of that spectrum. And so, but if you start looking at who's funding the research, who's doing the research, then it starts raising question marks about their findings. In fact, I read, and this wasn't a study the other day, but I read a news article that said that the United States Centers for Disease Control, the CDC of the United States, the governmental agency that monitors and health in the nation, actually owns the patent for 53 different vaccines. And I thought that was interesting, but why the group that would be overseeing the efficacy of that process would be the owner of the patents? And it seems to me that there would be a conflict of interest in that, but maybe smarter people than I have worked that out in their own minds. On your question polishing, Bobby and others have noted how consuming the content on the research technique is causing some serious consideration and reconsideration of your research questions. And I've tried to roll that to you, to pitch those things at you so that you feel safe changing your question or just abandoning the dadgum thing and trying another one, or massaging it to see if you can make it work, that you're changing the language on it. It's very important. It's very important. I think now more than ever, you understand how important it's your question is pretty narrow. Otherwise, you don't really stand a very good chance of getting data that you can rely on. And also Bobby mentioned that on the reconsideration of the research question, it's very important to think carefully about how you actually pose the questions or the tools that you're trying to use to answer that question with your sample set. I think I alluded to this last week, but I want to touch on it one more time, that correlation is not causation. We can find studies, and particularly in quantitative research, in all kinds of scientific fields, you can show a very strong relationship between two variables, but it doesn't necessarily mean that one of those variables is causing either an up movement or a downward movement in the other variable. For instance, I read not too long ago that the states in the United States that have far and away the highest propensity for obesity rates and type 2 diabetes are those states along the Gulf Coast of Mexico. Well, that means there's a very high correlation. If you're a Gulf Coast state, then you have extremely high rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes. That doesn't mean if you happen to live in Texas or Mississippi, that's causing you to have type 2 diabetes or obesity. It just means that there's a correlation between those two. Neither does it mean that if you're obese or if you have type 2 diabetes, that you're going to drift toward Alabama. Not the case. There's just a correlation there, a very tight alignment in those two, but one does not cause the other. Jade mentioned in her comments and that she's done some formalized research in the past, and she alluded to what's called SPSS software. That's the most robust research software that I know of. Most of you that may have done a study, if you have another master's degree, I can't imagine any of you actually did it in undergraduate school, but if you have another master's degree, you may very well have used the SPSS software. I only mention that to you. I mean, it's a robust tool and it's an expensive tool. However, most colleges and universities have it, the rights to it purchased so that it's at the disposal of their students and their faculty. But I mentioned that to you, that for those of you that choose to pursue a doctorate, you will most certainly be required to conduct a study, and you're most likely going to be putting your hands on that SPSS software. As has been my practice, a couple of books came to mind while I was reading through your stuff over the last week. And these are not, I mean, this is just not completely random thoughts, but just loosely connected to the things that I've been reading. One of the most prominent biologists in the history of the United States was a gentleman named Stephen Jay Gould. He taught at Harvard in the 80s, 90s, and maybe even into the early 2000s. Really a remarkable mind and an excellent writer. One of the science teachers of one of the high school campuses that I served as principal knew that I was that I like to read, and he also knew that I would like to read broadly. And so Jeff told me one day, he recommended one day that I read the book titled Full House, The Spread of Excellence from Plato to Darwin by Dr. Stephen Jay Gould. And it's a 96 copyright, but it was an excellent book. And I mention it to you because it's really a discussion of the tendencies from a biological perspective and historical evolutionary perspective of the tendencies of evolution. And one of the most interesting things in that book, Dr. Gould, that I can remember is that he said we tend to think in terms of humans being at the top of the food chain, or at the pinnacle of the evolutionary cycle, as if we sit atop the whole thing. And he argued that no, it's really not the case, that really evolution is like a tree that's just branching out in a lot of different directions, and humans just happen to occupy one of the branches of that tree. And I'd never really thought about that. The other book I would recommend to you is one I'm reading right now. If for those of you that have gotten an email from me in the last week or so, you see that on my current reading list. And one of the elementary teachers at the school I served as interim superintendent last year recommended this book to me. The title of it is Augmented: Life in the Smart Lane by Brett King, and it's copyright 2016. It's really an excellent historical accounting of computing technology and the internet and the interconnectivity component that makes this class possible for us tonight. But Brett King makes a pretty interesting argument about how not only how the evolution of that technology has accelerated our collective intelligence as a planet, but he argues that it's only going to accelerate at exponential speed, and even to the point where we won't even have computers anymore. That those computing and technological devices will be embedded in our clothes. Already they're in our cars, in our airplanes, our smartphones. And then I think I've mentioned to you before too that Dr. Deepak Chopra and Elon Musk both suggest that the technologies will be embedded within the human body, so that they'll just become more and more integrated in our lives. Something for us to think about as we're in the business of education and trying to help students learn. That's a lot of jibber jabber on my part. I'm going to shut up now and give you all the opportunity to ask me questions if you want to. You can ask them auditorially, speak loudly if you do, or if you want to post them in the chat window. I think you may or may not be aware, obviously I record these sessions for reference for those that can attend, or if you want to go back and listen to them. But when I kill the session, the chat board disappears and it does not get recorded. So that's one of the reasons if you post questions there, I repeat them out loud and then respond to them so that you'll have a record of that if you care. Got questions for me? I know you're swamped. Jiminy, Christmas, April at the schoolhouse. Something every night, every day, tests, year-ending ceremonies. Amy, you asked me about the feedback on the question thing last week. I think it was you that asked. Here's the way I want to handle that, because I'm very sensitive. What I don't want to do is discourage anybody. I want you to grapple with the questions, and certainly when you take a look at the questions of the entire class, some of them seem much more doable than others. Some of them are worded much more tightly than others. But if you want my specific feedback on your question, send me an email and ask me for feedback on your question. Because here's what I don't want to do, is I don't want to give you some sort of critical feedback and cause other people to just clam up. And that cuts back to my leadership style. I want to keep the learning freewheeling and moving, and I don't want to do anything that serves to put the brakes on it. some of you are on spring break. I didn't realize until beginning to work here for LSU Shreveport, and in Texas, almost all the spring breaks occur in mid-March. But evidently in Louisiana in particular, a lot of your spring breaks are coordinated with the Easter season, evidently. Can I give an example of a good, or Stacy asked, could I give an example of a good question and why? Well, yeah, I think so. A good question that I think is reasonably doable would be something like, can the provision, how does the provision of a 30-minute recess versus a 15-minute recess impact the academic outcomes for third graders at an elementary school situated in the Deep South? So that you're studying only one school, you got a fairly well-defined sample set, although not large, and depending on the elementary school, maybe 100, 150 third graders in that school, or not very many elementary schools would have more than that. You would be able to control that so that you had one group with 15-minute recesses and one group with 30-minute recesses. Of course, you'd have to fight it out with the teachers on which ones were going to get which recess lengths. But that would be a fairly doable, and here's why, and this kind of cuts to one of those words you all may or may not have learned this week that seemed to be a word that stumped some of you, parametric. There were some pretty well-defined parameters to that study that I just mentioned. One, and let me just touch on that issue of parametric versus non-parametric. You all know what the word parameter is, and so it's not different from that in the research context. When you're doing a parametric study, you're basically putting some boundaries on it. Some limitations is really what it amounts to. So those parameters that I put on that particular research question, I limited it to third graders. I limited it to an elementary school in the South. I limited the options for study to either be 15-minute recess or 30-minute recess, not 17-minute recess or not long recess versus short recess. So I began boxing in that question pretty tightly so that there were some things there that I could try to control to see if the outcomes, if I could measure some reasonable outcomes on the backside of that. One of the ways I try to remember the difference in parametric and non-parametric is I use an analogy of fishing, ocean fishing, commercial fishing. If I'm commercial fishing in the ocean with nets, I can set boundaries of the kinds of fish that I think I'm gonna catch by whether I fish in shallow water or deep water, whether I fish close to the shore or away from the shore, whether the holes in the nets are 8 or 10 inches to allow smaller fish to go through, or whether the nets are really tight, whether I let the nets run deeply, or whether I keep the nets running shallow toward the surface. So that's parametric stuff. I'm fishing in a very parametric way because I'm setting some boundaries on my expectation of catch. It's illegal in the United States, probably the whole world, but some people fish with dynamite. That would be, and so what they do is they set off a charge in the water and basically stun all of the living critters in the vicinity of that dynamite explosion, and they float to the top, and then they just pick out the fish or the critters that they've stunned or killed that they want. That would be a non-parametric method of fishing because it's a big splatter shoot and scorched earth kind of approach. And you get what you get. You know, you might get Moby Dick, or you might get a whole bunch of minnows, or alligators, or jellyfish. You know, you're going to get a little bit of everything, but at the same time, it becomes very difficult then to make sense of what you're trying to accomplish if you just kill everything or you stun everything and you float it to the top. So that's one example, Stacy. Let's see if I got another. Those tricky citations. Marchie. Yeah, you know, I hate to be an asshole about that, but and I want you to get them right. It's important that you get 4 pieces right. You got to tell us who, and the who needs to be the human that developed the content, if you can find it. Now, you all had one this week in Learning Task 4. Is that, yeah, Learning Task 4.3, I think, is the one. There was no way you were going to find a human name attached to that. So you all used the Center for Research Quality, I think was the entity, and that was the best you can do. But like on the John Schultz video, several of you, you attributed Southampton University as the creator of the content. No, John Schultz was the creator of that content. So you always want to try to find the human or the humans. Quite often it's a group who deserve credit. So you tell me who. And I haven't even been too stickler about you getting it in the right order, although you need to get it in the right order. You need to tell me what year it was created. It doesn't have to be the month, but it does need to be the year that it was created, not the year you dialed it up or looked at it. You need to tell me the title of the piece, either the title of the video, the title of the article, the title of the book, the title of the blog, but you need to tell the title. And then the very last piece is, where did you find it and where can other learners find it? And be specific. Don't just say on the internet or in Moodle. No, not everybody can go to Moodle, our Moodle module, and get it. I know you got it there, but not everybody has access to that. So you give the URL if it's an internet link, or if it's a library holding, you specify the journal article, and usually the journals are the name of the journal might be Journal of American Medical Association, JAMA, and it'll have volume 73, and then it has several little identifying components. But what you're doing is you're leaving a very clear breadcrumb trail for other researchers and other learners to get to that same content, either if they want to consume it or they want to check, make sure you're not just making stuff up. When citing a video, you would cite the person who wrote the script rather than the narrator. Carly asked that question. When citing a video, would you cite the person who wrote the script rather than the narrator? Right. Yeah, if you can differentiate that. In most cases, you can assume that the person that's doing the speaking, especially in the videos that I'm pitching to you, you can assume that the videos, the narrator, the person doing the speaking is the one that also crafted the language. If you were looking at for instance, a nightly news, a news anchor reading the news on a news programs, most of them do not do their own writing. There would be other writers that wrote that. You might have a hard time getting your hands on their name, but yeah, Carly, yes. Other questions you got for me? I don't think I've missed one. I'm back in my office. The last 2 weeks, you've had to look at me in a vehicle. Well, okay. I'm not going to belabor the point. You all know how to get me. I think I've said this to you before, but And I know there's over 100 of you, and I know that you all have wide networks and you know a lot of people, but I can assure you that you do not know anybody that's more blessed than I am. And one of the huge blessings, in which I'm grateful every day, is that I get the opportunity to learn with and from you all. It's just makes my juices flow to get to engage with your minds. And that's one of the reasons I peck at some of you on the grading stuff when I'm pecking at you to try to get you to dig a little deeper. I know you're swamped, and I know you're in a hurry, but I want to see inside your brain a little more. Okay, I will hit the pause button here and turn this baby off, and I'll get it uploaded so you can share it with your family at Easter lunch on Sunday if you're having a big family gathering. No, don't do that. I hope those of you that have a holiday have a nice one. And we are now only about 2 weeks from the finish line. So hang in there. We'll get it. Have a good evening.